Good morning, everyone. Since we're doing a virtual day, I wanted to jump into chapter 5. We had everything sort of up to date as of chapter 4. I know we had sort of wrapped that course up. I am going to go ahead and post some more of the caste system videos. If you guys want to take a moment to review those a little bit more, you can continue to watch that about the untouchables, as far as the children in the caste system in that particular culture. I think that's always really important for us to look at how culture impacts social class and statuses that we have. All in all, with a lot of them, we live in a society where we can move from status to status as we choose. In certain cultures, that's not always the case. A lot of times that ascribed status in that particular culture is something in which they cannot move from. All right, so we're going to jump into chapter 5. Chapter 5, we're talking about social groups and formal organizations. This chapter is always sort of interesting because we look at different groups within our society. We talked about cultures in that sense and subcultures, but now we're going to look specifically at the groups that exist. So know that every society has a tendency to overpower a particular individual. We tended to see this happen quite often in post-industrial society. Durkheim, Emile Durkheim, who we've talked about as far as social groups and inclusion, and he talked about the suicide rates, all that kind of stuff. He believed that small groups serve sort of like a lifeline that helps prevent anonymity. He honestly believes that small groups serve a very specific purpose in our society. And so we're going to look at these groups a little bit more. We're going to talk about primary groups, and we're going to look at secondary groups, some in and out groups, even some reference groups as well, social networks, all that kind of stuff. So throughout this course, we're going to dive into that a little bit deeper. We're going to have you guys understand what all those specific dynamics are in more detail. And then we are going to break those apart a little bit more. Okay? All right. So let's talk about primary groups first. We all within our society have different types of groups, right? Sociologist Charles H. Cooley, okay, remember Cooley? He was the one with the looking glass self. He used the term primary group to refer to groups that are characterized by cooperative, intimate, very long-term, face-to-face relationships, right? We all have primary groups that we're very familiar with. Our family and friends, right? These are individuals that we see on a daily basis. We know them sort of inside and out. We're sort of choose to have some of these individuals within our lives from time to time. Think about it. They play such a huge role in the development of who we are as ourselves, right? A lot of times our family are our go-to people from time to time. Now, there are obviously families that are maybe not as healthy in their setup. And so we know that at times, again, that can impact how somebody interacts with other people. The family has been primarily one of the basic ways in which we develop who we are. As you guys get older and you decide to be in other kinds of relationships or friendships or whatever that looks like, those are very intimate relationships. You're picking and choosing who those individuals are within your life. You're bringing them into it. If you decide that one day you want to have children, those are all parts of things that are part of that primary group. Okay? Now, on the flip side of this, there's something called secondary groups. Secondary groups are much larger, relatively temporary, more anonymous a lot of times, formal in a sense. Think about it, very impersonal compared to primary groups. And typically they tend to be based on some interest or activity. Okay? Think about it. Right now, you probably have quite a few secondary groups. Maybe it's a sport team that you're on. Maybe it's just that you're part of a particular class, the senior class or the junior class or whatever, right? These are all groups that are much larger in a sense. You don't necessarily hang out with everybody, right? They're not part of your circle, but they are part of a much larger group that you encompass. You have something that's sort of pulling you guys all together. So if it's just that you're in the same age bracket, or maybe you're on the same sport team, or in the same club, or in the same musical group, or whatever the case is, right? All of those are much more formal in a sense. You might be nice acquaintances with somebody, polite, but it's not necessarily that you share your intimate details with everybody in that particular group, right? Here's a cartoon. Let me say this. There are times in which you meet people, right, as part of your secondary group, but eventually they may become more of a primary group to you in that sense. Think about it. Have you met somebody, maybe they just moved to your school and you became really close with them, right? Because they were part of that particular class that you were in. But all of a sudden, something that was very informal in a sense transitioned to something very much more personal in that sense. So all of a sudden now, we have somebody who has a much more deep, rich kind of relationship with somebody because of that secondary group that they were in. Okay. Here's an image here of a cartoon. How our participation in social groups shapes our self-concept is a focus of symbolic interactionists. In this process, knowing who we are not is as significant as knowing as who we are. So think about that. All of a sudden, who we hang out with at times can sometimes define us in a sense, right? These are very important in developing ourselves, developing who we are and our identity overall. Now, groups tend to drift individuals to feeling loyal at times, right? It's that in-group kind of concept. While all of a sudden, those in which you might feel antagonisms are sometimes called out-groups. Think about it. Do you have a certain group of individuals that you tend to hang out with, that you feel like you belong, or you feel comfortable with, or that they're your people, right? Sometimes those individuals we associate a lot more of ourselves with, right? It's sort of that collective whole, like, okay, they're part of us, that us kind of thing, right? Now, those in-groups that we share some type of relation to might help shape our perception of what's right and wrong. They help guide us in a lot of things that we do. Think about an in-group that you feel comfortable in. Maybe it's that sport team, or maybe it's your little group of friends that are maybe consist of like 4 or 5 of you, right? They're the people that maybe you go to ask how things are going, or you might reach out to them if you're having a problem, right? They help us, guide us along that way. Now, on the flip side of it, there are things such as out-groups. Maybe it's that larger sense. Oh, well, they're the popular kids, or they're the ones that always are involved in things, or whatever that case is. That out-group sense of it sometimes feels almost that ideology of that them kind of concept, where you just don't feel like you belong. You sort of feel an outsider in that sense. That's typical. Even as adults, we have those ins and out groups. At work, if you were ever to go to work, sometimes you'll see those, right? There's cliques, there's specific groups of individuals that tend to drift towards one another. A lot of times what we don't realize is how those can influence us in so many ways, right? Think about it. When we are in high school, and high school is probably one of the most poignant kind of example that you can, we tend to see it happen all the time in those sort of sense. But as you get older, they still exist. Members of primary and some secondary groups feel loyal to those groups and take pride in, sometimes even in belonging in them. Think about it. In college, do we not have things that people join all the time, like fraternities, sororities, right? Maybe it's you're joining a travel league. That's your sport team. or juvenile gangs are all parts of those in-groups. So a lot of times what happens is members of those in-groups often end up competing with members of another group for various kinds of rewards. So those other groups a lot of times are called those out-groups. And sometimes that competition between in-groups and out-groups is often friendly. Like if it's an intramural team, like do we not have rivals in our sports? You know, oh, it's the throwdown between Berlin and whoever else, right? It's almost that thing, whether it's that athletic event or that academic year or whatever, sometimes those in-group members look down their noses at out-group members. Some can even act very hostile toward them, especially when you start looking at gang groups, right? Rival fraternity members at several campuses have been known to get into fights and trash each other's houses. Obviously, those street gangs attack each other. Hate groups, right? Sometimes we have hate groups, like the skinheads and the Ku Klux Klan have committed violence against people of color or Jews or other individuals because they consider them out groups. So when we look at these examples, those in-group memberships can promote very negative attitudes towards the out-groups with which those in-groups feel they're competing with. So these attitudes are